Hi, everybody. It is just after Shabbat, the 21st of September, 2019, the 21st day of Elul 5779. You're listening to Eve Harrow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. And now I'm about to say something that you've never heard me say before. I'm recording this in Lisbon, Portugal. My husband and I are here for a week with a wonderful group organized by the person that you're about to hear, Dr. Hagi Amitzur. The B'ikvot Anusim, which means literally in the footsteps of the Anusim, of the crypto Jews that kept their Judaism despite very, very difficult conditions for the last few hundred years. But it's much more than that. So first of all, I'll just introduce Dr. Hagi Amitzur, whom I met years ago in the tour guide course, was one of my favorite teachers, remained as such over the years. And I have gone B'ikvot Hagi Amitzur, you could say to some degree, following Hagi, other courses that he's given. And the group here, which is close to 30 people, close to 30 Israelis, are all, I would say, like fans of Hagi, are either students of his or neighbors of his in one way or the other. So he's the head of the Galilee Studies Institute and a non-stop researcher of Jewish history, but really much, much more than that. So first of all, Hagi, it's very late on Saturday night, and we have a long day, another long day tomorrow, but thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind words that you were saying about me. And it's been a privilege and an honor to lead such a wonderful group in the footsteps of one of the, let's say, the unknown episodes of Jewish history. And this is something that I was doing for several years now, and taking people and going through different events and getting to know something that people really, really, really don't know about.
And that's exactly one of the things that I want to talk to you about. I consider myself fairly knowledgeable on Jewish history. My husband and I like to travel wherever we go. The first thing we do is book the Jewish tour there. And so for me, this is a fabulous week because the whole week is the Jewish tour. But everyone knows about the Holocaust and the way and people go to Poland and to see what happened and about other miserable episodes in Jewish history. But the way that we learn about the Inquisition is there was a golden age. I'm giving it very simplistically, but that's really how many people learned it, not just in the United States where I got my education, also in Israel. There's the golden age of Spain. For 500 years, the Jews were here. They were scientists. They were rabbis, the beginnings of Kabbalah. Then in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella come up. They insist that the Jews either convert or die to Catholicism. That's the end of the Golden Age in Spain. And Portugal is not even mentioned. And one of the things that, like, it's mentioned in conjunction with Spain, and that's that. And I know I have family roots here, and they fled to Germany, and as do many other Jews. But we're here in Portugal, and I'm seeing this happen, not just for myself, but everyone in the group who happened to be a very learned group of people. These are not people who just decided to come on this trip. And it was so much worse here, the Inquisition. And as you've explained, because they didn't have the chance to leave. So what happened here in Portugal that was different from Spain?
Well, a couple of corrections, first of all, to what you said. The Golden Age did not last 500 years.
That's how we learned it. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. The Golden Age in Spain, lasted for something like 250, maybe even less. And already in the 11th and 12th century, everything was very, very miserable and bad for the Jews. And actually, Portugal did not exist at that time. So when we are saying the word Spain in those days, we mean the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, and not just Portugal or Spain. Later on, Portugal received its, let's say, some sort of independence and declared itself as a separate and different. And therefore, usually when we look at the history of the Portuguese Jewry, it's in the shade of the Spanish, because over there were the great rabbis, and over there remained all the Torah study centers and everything. And most people did not come to live in Portugal. But in Portugal, for example, in the 15th century, one of the great rabbis that was here was Don Yitzchak Abarbanel. Everyone knows him from his commentary on the Tanakh. And usually, but even his name, when we refer to Don Yitzchak, Don is a Portuguese title. And therefore, You don't hear about Don I don't know what, Rambam or Don whatever, because they are Spanish scholars and they do not come from Portugal. But so this is one thing. And in Portugal there was a Torah study center, there was a Jewish community, and there were Jews all over the place. But what really happened was in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella decided to expel the Jews from Spain, as you mentioned, Eve, they were given a choice. They had to choose. If they wanted to stay, they had to convert to Christianity. But they had the option to go, and they had the option to leave. And therefore, hundreds of thousands of Jews who decided they want to continue their Jewish heritage, they wanted to keep their Judaism, they left Spain. Some of them left to North Africa, some to the Ottoman Empire, but many of them, something like 120,000 to 150,000 Jews went to Portugal, expecting to return to Spain as soon as possible. Most of them settled in the high mountains area close to the Portuguese-Spanish border because they said, oh, well, in a couple of years they will regret and will be able to go back home. So they settled over there. Some of them went to the big cities like Lisbon, but they were all the time looking forward to go back to Spain because this is where they felt this was their home, this is the place where they lived, this is the place where they studied, this is where we want to go back to. 4 years after the expulsion from Spain, the Portuguese king is going to get married with the daughter of the Spanish kings of Ferdinand and Isabella. And she wanted a wedding gift. She said, my parents took care that there will be no Jews and no non-Christians in Spain. If you want to marry me, this is what you need to do. And now we have a problem. Because on one hand, he wanted the Jews. They are the learned people, they are the nobles, they are the money and finance and everything. They brought the wealth, they brought the knowledge, they brought everything with them. They were the backbone of the Portuguese economy in those days. Just to mention, even before that, when the Portuguese in the 15th century were the greatest, biggest naval empire of the world, it was based on Jewish knowledge. The person who drew the maps for all the Portuguese sailors to go, and on these maps based also Columbus's journey and Vasco da Gama and all the others, they were Jews. One of them was Avraham Zakut, one of the greatest astronomers of the time. And he has even 2 craters on the moon named after him because the world recognized his donation and what he gave to the world as far as his knowledge. So they went and they were in Portugal, these people, and he understood and realized the king, I don't want to lose these Jews because I don't want them to go anywhere else. But on the other hand, he wanted to marry this fine lady and to strengthen the relationship between the Portuguese kingdom and the Spanish kingdom of the time. So what are they going to do? So what he decided to do is to tell the Jews that he is going to send them back to Spain. But in order to do that, he needs them to gather together and to assemble in the central square in Lisbon, which was the harbor city, and from there ships could take them back to Spain and lead them to the place where they want to go. The Jews that accepted his call gathered all together in the central square, and once they were standing over there, suddenly all the priests came out from all the churches and from everything and everywhere around. They drizzled a little bit of water on top of the heads of the Jews and said, that's it, you are Christians from now on. And actually and literally speaking, the Jews and this fine Jewry in Portugal vanished in one day. The next morning, there were no Jews in Portugal.
So they were baptized. They were just standing in the square. They got baptized, and then in 1 minute, there are no Jews anymore. They're all considered Christian.
All considered Christians, which means that all the synagogues were dismantled and destroyed. No Jewish community ceremonies or whatever could take place anywhere. But most of them, they came to Portugal in order to continue practice Judaism, because this is why they left Spain. And now suddenly they can't continue practice Judaism anymore. To add to that, the Portuguese king blocked and seized the ports and disallowed anyone to leave the country. So they were trapped, and they were like prisoners here in Portugal. So the only option for them was to become crypto-Jews, to hide their Judaism, to continue and practice different ceremonies and different practices, but hiding themselves from the outside. And suddenly there were no more Jews in Portugal. And in those days, they didn't have Inquisition in Portugal. 40 years later, they realized that many of these new Christians doesn't really practice Christianity the way the church wanted them to do that. So this is how and why Inquisition started in Portugal in 1536.
So, we've just been here for 3 days. We have 4 days, actually, including Shabbat. And then we have, which we obviously didn't travel on, we have another 3 days. So really only halfway through the trip. And I've cried every single day, standing near a stake in the middle of a town square, in front of the church, where the Lion of Judah, the little symbol that had been in the synagogue, is now proudly waved on the top of the church. Not even an attempt to hide what they were doing. You showed us the little pits on the steps around the stake where oil was put so that the fire would be even higher. I believe this was Trancoso, if I'm not mistaken, where they have the list of the Jews. We know exactly who was burnt at the stake. The children taken away from the parents to be raised as Christians. The parents refusing to renounce their Judaism, burnt at the stake. In one of the refurbished synagogues there's an old Torah scroll that was brought from India. And you don't even know, but I was sobbing. You read from the Torah. It's on deerskin. It's a very, very precious Torah. And just thinking about the people who died to remain Jewish and went through so much. And now to get to this big question, why don't we know this? Why is this story not in the textbooks? This kind of thing about the Inquisition in Spain, but the story about the Jews of Portugal only came out really in the last century or so. So, why is that?
That's right. Because they were hiding themselves so well that no one knew about them. For example, you remember and you recall that 2 days ago we visited a village called Belmont. In Belmont, till 1917, they were sure they are the last Jews in the world. Yeah. And then one day, because it's up high in the mountains, there are mines over there, one day a Jewish engineer that came from Poland and Russia arrived over there, and he went to the village over there because they ran out of dynamite, and the only option to get dynamite was to buy it at the grocery in the village. So he entered the village, and when he entered the village, he asked, where can I buy this dynamite? They said, there are 2 places that you can buy, but don't go to that one. This is a Jewish store. So in 1917, the locals over there still knew that they are hiding and they're practicing different things like that. So obviously he decided to go to this shop, and when he came there and he started to speak with them, and he showed himself as a Jew and identified himself as a Jew, so they said, there's no such thing. We are the last Jews in the world. And they said, okay, so please tell us one thing that will prove us that you are really a Jew. So he recited the Shema. He said, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And when he said God's name, they suddenly closed their eyes. They started to scream and say, no, don't say that. This is something that you say only when you hide, when no one hears, when no one... But that was a proof for them that he is really a Jew.
So like 400 years, they lived in fear. one of the things that has come out so strongly this week is that it was the mothers, because they couldn't do anything in public. They couldn't have Torah readings. They couldn't give their sons bar mitzvahs. They couldn't have public prayer, because Judaism is very much a religion of community. We need to live together. You need to have a minyan, a prayer quorum. If you want to have kosher food, you need to have the proper butcher. We're very much a people that needs to live with other Jews. And they are living in fear for all these years. And it was the mothers who taught the traditions to the children, who quietly lit the Shabbat candles. And we saw in the museum, it looks like a ceramic pot. You would never know it was to light Shabbat candles. It's something that I've seen in other places as well, where it just looks like a little pot. And then there were a couple candles in there, so no one would know it was Shabbat candles. And they taught their children, the children, some of the prayers and some of the traditions, and baking matzot. And you told us fascinatingly, because how did they know the Jewish calendar? Well, they knew when Easter was, because Easter, maybe you can tell this to my audience.
Yeah, they knew when Easter was. Easter is in springtime, and according to the Torah, the thing is that you need to celebrate Pesach as Chag HaAviv, as the festival of springtime. So they looked when was the new moon, the beginning of the new month, at the time when Easter was. They calculated and counted 14 days, and on the 14th day of the new month that started the same time of Easter, they celebrated Pesach. But they didn't celebrate on the first day, they celebrated on the third day. They made Leila Seder because they knew that the non-Jews, the Christians over there, will look after them, and the Inquisition may come. And the Inquisition usually used to come on Leila Seder because they knew that this is something that Jews continued to keep. So they shifted the celebration to make sure that no one will be able to trace them. And as you mentioned before, men would go out. They will work. They had to go to church. They had to participate with the community, with everything. Women, especially in those days, stayed at home. So they could deliver down line the entire heritage through songs. When a child is going to sleep, the mother will just stand next to him or sit next to him and sing him a rhyme to send him to sleep. And through that, she will put on all the words and everything. And as we saw on the way, different songs that actually recite the mitzvah, the commandments, and different verses from the Torah, and different episodes that happened to Jewish people coming out from Egypt, and on all these things, that this was the way to keep it. And as you mentioned before, you said about the Inquisition. It's unbelievable, but no one realized that in Portugal, Inquisition continued till 1821. The last Jew was put to death in 1821. It's unbelievable. It's 300 years of Inquisition, 300 years of terrorizing all those who tried to keep something of Judaism or whatever. And nevertheless, they continued all the time.
One of the things that has struck everyone on this group, and it's a mixed group from all different levels of religious observance, is the faith that kept them going. It's just astonishing to us, because we live in a world where, okay, in the Muslim countries, it's different. It's not so easy to be a Jew, even if you are there, and virtually no one is left. But you can in the West, and I imagine most of the people listening to this show, if you want to be Jewish, if you want to light candles, you can do it. But here they had people who literally kept the faith, and the vast majority did not. And I think that's important to say. The vast majority either just gave up over the years, and none of us can even begin to judge them, or adopted Christianity willingly. And I know that probably many people listening and many people who live in South America today have some trace of Jewish blood. And I think it's also important to mention that they weren't considered halachically Jewish. The ones that were found in these villages 100 years ago, many of them have now converted to Judaism and are living full Jewish lives, especially in Israel. But this faith, this idea that Hashem wants something from us and we can't let it go, despite the most severe price to be paid for keeping the Judaism alive. It's just something that I see all of us, and even you who leads the tours here and has for many, many years. It's something so huge. It's something almost more than human.
Yeah, and it is something, as you mentioned before, unknown. People don't know about all these stories and all these things. And in the 20th century, these things started. For example, okay, we'll take one of the stories of the Portuguese Dreyfus, the Colonel Arturo Basto Baroche. He was born in 1886. When he was 9, his grandfather called him to the corner of the room and said secretly and quietly, I want to tell you a secret. He said, I would like to tell you that we are Jews. He didn't know what it meant, because he went to church and he was baptized and everything was done. So he started to try to find his Jewish roots and whatever should be done with that. And eventually in 1904, he went to the rabbi in Lisbon and said, I would like to convert to Judaism. And this guy didn't want to convert him. He said, you are part of the script. No, you are not a Jew. So he went looking who will find, who will do. And during First World War, he was an officer in Flandria. And one evening, suddenly, when they were sitting with all the officers over there, one of the officers said, well, excuse me a minute, I have to do something. And he went aside and he lit candles because he was Jew. So Basto Baroche asked him, what are you doing? He said, well, this is candle lighting for Shabbat lighting. And he asked him questions and kept asking questions about Judaism, about his faith, about these things. And eventually he decided to convert to Judaism. He was circumcised. And not only that, but he started to travel in the villages, in the mountains, looking for his, let's say, lost brothers, those crypto Jews who were, in many of the places, they didn't want to show themselves as Jews because they were too afraid. So when he called them to be circumcised in Porto, which is something like today, it's 3 hours drive, and you can imagine to yourself that at the beginning of the 20th century, this was a real journey to do from these up high mountains all the way to the big cities. And this was one of the reasons why they didn't want to circumcise. So what he did, he took one of his friends, his army fellows, who was a doctor and a surgeon, and he also converted to Judaism. He took him with him and they rode to all these places, and anyone who said, well, I would like to be, he circumcised them over there. So this was really something, and it's mainly up high in the mountains. It's a very isolated area. Even today, it's quite difficult to get there. There are very narrow roads, very winding roads and routes up in the mountains and everywhere. And definitely during those days, about a century ago, and even a couple of centuries ago, it was much more difficult to get to there. But on the other hand, this is why they could hide over there and keep some sort of Judaism in these places. In 1992, for example, in Belmont, where we visited, 150 people decided that they want to form, once again, a Jewish community. Not just to live as private families, each and every one for himself, which was the situation along the centuries. So they converted to Judaism, full conversion. The chief rabbi of Israel came, and there was a big ceremony, and there was a wealthy person that donated and built them a synagogue over there. And they have today actually a real formal Jewish community with everything, with keeping kashrut and keeping Shabbat and having all the ceremonies over there and the services. They even have a rabbi that we were lucky enough to meet him here in Lisbon, because on Friday morning he just returned from Israel. He was on his way to Belmont. He was the rabbi of Belmont, and obviously he couldn't get there before Shabbat, so he stayed here in Lisbon, and we met him here in Lisbon. But once again, everything ties up together and everything connects, and it's really, really a fascinating story that we must tell. How people were willing to pay the price, as high it would be, Mesirut Nefesh, a real Mesirut Nefesh, for keeping their faith and keeping what they could, because most of the things they couldn't do. But they really, it was very, very important for them to continue and keep that. This is the reason, for example, why they only intermarried among themselves, one family with the other, which today causes lots of problems, with genetic problems with relationship between these people. And some of the stories are fascinating because not every time they knew which were the families of these crypto Jews. So let's assume, in one of the stories, for example, is that one guy met a young lady and they decided to get married. But before they got married, he said, well, there is something that I must ask you to do after we will be married. I said, okay, tell me what you want to do and we'll keep that. He said, every Friday morning you should go to the market, buy a piece of pork, come back home with that, wrap it in a paper and put it in the bin. She looked at him astonishingly and said, this is exactly what we are doing at our home. Wow. This is our, because Jews, what they did in order to show that they are proper and good Christians, they went publicly to the market and made all the things that people will think that they are keeping all the Christian practices, and when going home, they would do something totally different.
So they had like signals between them to understand, because if you made a mistake and told the wrong person, then the Inquisition could come, or so they thought, and they weren't wrong. When we walked around some of these towns, we didn't go to all of them. We just went to a few. I think you told us there are 37 that they now know the Jews were living. Carved, because the whole area here is like granite rocks. It's just beautiful. And I have to say that the drive up to the mountains was one of the most beautiful drives I've ever been on. Vineyards, you speak about Portos, that's where port wine comes from, and rivers and vineyards and greenery. You could see how long it would take people to get there. Even with our modern bus and the roads, it took a long time to get there, but it was just absolutely magnificent. But the houses are all made of stone, apropos what I just said about granite, and carved into the stone. You showed us house after house, and you have to know where to look. A cross that had been turned into a menorah, or Jacob's ladder, or upside down or backwards the name of God. And you told us how there was no mezuzah. Obviously, they couldn't have the mezuzah. That's a telltale sign that it's a Jewish home. But they would kiss the lintel as they walked into the door. They would touch it, and then they would touch their pocket where a mezuzah was in the pocket, and then they would kiss that. So any way that they could connect, but surreptitiously, secretly, all the time. But some of these carvings are just, to see them now and to understand that these are people who the Inquisition had, signed the house, right? These are Christians, yet making another little carving or a little bit of a change, this defiance of, no, there are Jews in this house. You don't know it, but there are Jews. There are people who are keeping the faith in this house.
Yeah, that's right. It's amazing. Not only that, for example, one of the researchers that they started to make with these people, some of the researchers went with them to follow their daily practices and whatever. And they suddenly saw that every time they came to a church, even those who still continued to practice Christianity, when they would go into the church, they were mumbling something. So the researchers tried to understand what they are saying. And finally, they said, what are you saying over there? What are you whispering or whatever? They said, we don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? This is what you're doing, and everyone is doing that. And finally, they found out that what they are saying is shaketz teshaktzenu. These are words from the Torah that describes paganism and idol worshipping. And these Jews, they went to the church because this is what was expected from them as Christians, to go to the church and practice. But whenever they would go, just before they entered, they would stand a minute and they would say shaketz teshaktzenu, and everything. And this is part of how they lived here. And this is something, as you mentioned at the beginning, they don't know about. People don't know about it. It's an unknown story. Many people know about the Inquisition in Spain, all the stories over there about Leila Seder and different things that have to do with Spain and Spain and Spain and Spain. One of the reasons is because in Spain there was a really very, very big Torah study centers, and therefore many things were written down, which was transferred later on to Italy and Salonika and other places as well. So people could, let's say a century later or 2 centuries, read about it. And what they would read about the stories in Spain. In Portugal, no one wrote it. So it remained a hidden story.
And I know that, like, when I take people around Sfat and we talk about the Inquisition, because many of the Kabbalists came initially from Spain, stopped in Saloniki, where I was a few months ago, and made their way to Eretz Israel. So the story really becomes focused on Spain. But something you did for us this week, which is why I really want to encourage people, if you can, to come here. You need to learn about the story, but if there's any way that you can come here and see it for yourselves, it's hard to put into words how meaningful it is. But one of the things that you got special permission for in the university, and I'm going to totally butcher the name, where we got to see possibly, which was the personal Bible of whom you mentioned a few minutes ago, Donna Barbanel. So I just want to say before I give the mic to you to talk about that Tanakh, is that one of the things that I didn't know is that J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books, lived in Portugal for a few years. And some of the inspiration for her book actually came from this university, which until 100 years ago was the only university in Portugal. It's one of the oldest in Europe. And till today, the students are walking around. We walked in there. We said, it looks like a scene from Harry Potter, because the students are walking around with those same uniforms and the professors with these cowls around their neck. And it was like falling into the stage of Harry Potter. So that was another little connection that many of us didn't know. And I was just in Universal Studios a few weeks ago where I saw the set for Harry Potter. So there was just as a little aside. But everywhere you go, everywhere you travel, you just learn new things that there's no replacement for it. Anyhow, tell us about, as long as you go with Hagi, of course, no, as long as you go with the guide. But tell us a little bit about this Bible. And it's massive. This isn't like a little microchip. Now you can take a Bible really in a microchip and you can put it in anything. But this is a very large book. And what's the history of this book?
We don't really know exactly what happened to this book. It is handwritten on parchment. So just imagine to yourself the pages of the book. Each one is a parchment like the Torah, so it's a very thick book. It's not something very heavy. And it wandered around the world. Because when Jews were able, and some of them managed and were able to leave Portugal to go to Holland, for example, and this is why when you go to Amsterdam, you see over there the big Portuguese synagogue of these people that came from Portugal.
Before the Inquisition.
Yeah. They came. In the 4 years between 1492 and 1496, okay, Jews were allowed to leave Portugal. They had to pay a lot of money, so usually only the wealthy people were able to do that. But there were lots of people that, you mentioned Sfat, for example. Mm-hmm. Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhav, okay, came from Lisbon. Oh. Rabbi Yosef Caro came from Lisbon. All these people, they left Spain, they came to Portugal, they stayed in Lisbon, and from Lisbon they moved on to other places around the world, and eventually some of them found their way to Tzfat. And when we guide in Tzfat, we visit Tzfat, we usually mention these people, but this was the route that they were taking over there. And these people, when they were wandering around, they took with them the books. And one of the books that was taken was this Bible of Abarbanel, which we assume, okay, the modern research assumed that this is the private Bible of Abarbanel because of lots of reasons. I'm not going to express now all of them, but it was taken from there and it was wandering around the world and it found itself, okay, it found its way to Amsterdam. Now maybe the more interesting thing is that mid-19th century, this university sitting in Portugal, realizing that over there in Amsterdam there is such a treasure that they should acquire, they sent a librarian to look for this gem, to look for this real treasure, buy it and get it to the library. And still today it is considered as the jewel of the crown in the library over there, in the very, very rare manuscripts that are holding in the library. And as we were going over there, usually when you go to the library, you go to see the old library, and there is a fascinating library, like Hogwarts. It looks really like...
It really does. It's absolutely beautiful. We weren't even allowed to take pictures because even the flash can do something to the books and to the wood. So you'll have to take my word for it. It's an amazing place.
And not only that, but but if you have old books, then you have all these worms and everything over there, and you need to deal with that. So they have two special communities of bats living in the library. And every night they let out all these bats, and this is what they are. This is their food. They are consuming all the worms, and this is the way they are protecting the book. It's amazing. It's a really amazing story.
Yeah, and I have to say, because we were in the library, they didn't tell us until we were leaving that behind the eaves, like at the very top of the bookshelves, were at that very moment sleeping many, many bats. I'm not so sure how many of us would have gone in there had we known ahead of time. But that's, I guess, a natural, non-pesticide way of dealing with the books.
Yeah. But anyway, this is the place, the usual place where we were. But we had the privilege and the honor to.
It wasn't what's the name of the university again? Coimbra. I forgot. Coimbra. It was a privilege and honor, but it was also because Hagi wrote to them many, many, many months ago to say that we were a group of researchers and a group of people interested in Jewish history, which we are. And so they only take the Tanakh out of the safe under very, very strict conditions. Maybe once, maybe twice a year, and we were really privileged to be there and to see in Hebrew. I mean, and we could read it because we're all Israelis. So we're reading this Tanakh of hundreds of years ago that somebody with great difficulty made sure to take with them as they fled from place to place to place to place, fleeing always with the only reason to keep their Judaism, because for every economic and family and social and just comfort reason, it's much easier to stay put. And the reason that they were constantly fleeing and on the road was because they wanted to remain Jews.
Yep, definitely. Definitely that's the story.
It's humbling. It really is humbling. I mean, as someone who left my country of birth and my mother tongue and everything that was comfortable to go to Israel. And some people think that that's such a big deal. And the reason that we did it is because we wanted to live full Jewish lives and raise Jewish children in a Jewish homeland that we feel is prophecy fulfilled, that Hashem brought his people home, and how could we not be there? But it was so much easier to do that. And it still is so much easier to do that, hint, hint, to those of you who are listening and still haven't done that. And then it's really just so, the word that comes back is humbling, to see all my co-religionists who over the years had to make so much effort in order to stay Jewish. And I really have no words for that. And if anything encourages me, then not that I would ever think otherwise, of maintaining a very proud and vibrant Judaism, is that my people were chosen a long time ago for whatever it is, and we just have to keep doing it.
Yes, definitely. This is what we're studying when we travel around the world and we see all this Jewish heritage and everything. And we should remember that all they wanted through the years was L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim Habnuya. This was their dream, this was their vision, this was everything they looked for and waited for, and not all of them were able to even practice Judaism out in the open. And for example, here in Portugal, and this is the amazing story, more than 300 years of Inquisition, terrorized by the Christians, being really, really difficult to keep anything that has to do with some sort of Judaism. And they're still doing that, yep.
So interspersed with the Jewish history is, of course, the history of Portugal. We went to this magnificent fortress of the Templars, where they apparently had rebuilt Jerusalem. They'd come back from the Crusades in the early part of the 12th century. And there's like a replica of the Dome of the Rock, which is now, of course, a church. And realizing that we are also in the middle here of a Muslim-Christian battleground, the Moors and the Christians. I still happen to think that Europe is still part of that battleground, except that the Christians in Europe have forgotten that they're fighting the war. They're going to pay a very, very heavy price for that. But the Jews were once again caught in the middle of that. But then seeing things that I'm so familiar with in the Holy Land, like the Templars, whose name comes from the fact that their home base was on the Temple Mount. And then they brought that back to here. They brought it here back to the Christian world because of the importance of Jerusalem, but of course the distance. And so many of there's just so much here. There's so much history that if you're at all familiar with Israel, to come here and just see what was done, and some good people through there, although not too many.
Yes,
Yeah.
there are. Yeah.
It's been a long, difficult road. So before I let you go, because we do have a long day tomorrow, and since I am on this trip, just one of the participants, I don't have to be at the front of the bus, and I don't have to be worrying about anybody. I just get on in the morning and sit in my chair. It is such a pleasure for me. That made it a vacation before we even began. But one of the other projects that you've been doing for those who are listening from Israel or are planning to be in Israel soon is the Sanhedrin Trail. So just maybe a couple of minutes on something that you've been working on for a long time and that is there now for real.
Yeah. One of the privileges we have this generation is the fact that we can take all the letters that were written in Jewish history and the Jewish literature and Sifrut Chazal, rabbinic sources and everything, and not just learn it at the Bet Midrash, but rather take it and put it in the field, on the stone, stand on the same stone, at the same places, in the same... So the idea was to create a trail, a hiking trail along the Galilee that crosses the Galilee, following the different stations, the 5 stations that the Sanhedrin was situated in after the Bar Kokhba revolt, after the destruction of the temple. The Sanhedrin, the central unified leadership of the Jewish people, moved to the Galilee, and by the way, everything moved to the Galilee. And this is part of the things that we are researching and doing with all our projects with the Galilee Studies Institute, that you are more than welcome to follow different places, the website and everything. And this trail is following, it's 120 kilometers, going all the way from Beit She'arim to Tiberias, crossing the Galilee in the landscape and walking in the footsteps of Chazal. And at each and every place we formed different references and written sources and booklets and for everything. So you can just stand at these places and read the Torah of these rabbis, of these sages of Tanaim and Amoraim at the same spot where they actually really did that. We're walking through the archaeological excavations that were done at places that where these things were done. And the Sanhedrin Trail brought to effect that the Israel Antiquities Authority took some responsibility over the trail. And according to that and based on that, they went to do lots of archaeological excavations which otherwise would not be planned and would not be done. And at least 2 places like we can mention. One of them is Usha itself, which is amazing.
I can vouch for that because a year or 2 ago, I was with Hagi and a group in Usha, which had not been really dug before and is amazing.
And if you would come there today, you wouldn't believe what you see over there, because they found houses, they found places, they found things. They even found the place that probably was the synagogue of the site itself. In Usha, for example, one of the things that was found is a stone inscribed with the words Tchum Shabbat. Okay, so a Jew from Usha that was walking and wandering around on Shabbat, just going out to nature to travel around, he knew exactly where he should stop and return back to his village. And another place that was excavated in the last couple of years and has to do also with the Sanhedrin Trail is the place of Shechin, which is an ancient synagogue was found over there from the time of the temple, from the time of Second Temple. So Jews were living in the Galilee, dreaming and visioning going to Jerusalem. And not only that, but till a couple of years ago, the modern research tend to think that Jews arrived to the Galilee only after the Hashmonaean conquest. And in the Galilee, this happened around the year 104 BCE. During these excavations, they found coins that were minted in Jerusalem in 127 BCE, meaning that 20 years and more than 20 years before what we thought that we have Jewish presence in the Galilee, already people went to Yerushalayim on pilgrimage probably, and brought back as souvenirs, or maybe the change that was left them when they finished their shopping in Jerusalem with some of these coins, brought them back to the Galilee, and now we find them in archaeological excavations in the Galilee. So this is really something, once again, we can see the chain, the Jewish life, how it goes along history. Focusing on Yerushalayim, after the destruction of the temple, going to the Galilee. After a couple of centuries, moving all over around the place and everywhere. And today, thanks God, we are able to go back and return to our own independent state with everything Jewish over there. And you can really live a full Jewish life in the state of Israel today. Something that our ancestors and great-grandfathers or whatever could only dream of.
In looking at the houses with the little Jewish symbols scratched into them, I could only think also about how, like, we light our menorah, we light our Chanukiah, actually, on Chanukah, in the window, Pirsum Hanes, we're not hiding anymore. We can be strong and proud Jews and show the symbols. And that in itself, to be able to stand in these places where Jews had to hide their Judaism for so long, and to just think to them and to send that thought to them wherever they are, that it wasn't for nothing. You should just know that you kept the faith and so did others, and we're still here. And I don't know if that in any way, and of course it doesn't make up for the terrible things that they went through, but at least it's not just visiting some tribe, like some interesting tribe in the past, and then they're gone. This is a long and continuous story that I hope, and as I know you do, the best is yet to come. So Dr. Hagi Amitzur, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the next few days and to all of your work. What is the website if people listening want to follow some of your work?
It can be either found on a place called Noam Haaretz or the Galilee Studies Institute.
Is it in English also, or it's only in Hebrew?
At the moment, it is only in Hebrew, but we're working on opening an English version as well.
In the meantime, you can all learn Hebrew, as I keep telling you to do. Okay, thank you, everyone, for listening. Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. I'm Eve Harrow. Thanks to Tabitha and to Ben. And I'm going to go to sleep now because I know tomorrow is going to be a very long, emotional, and exciting day. So take care, everybody. Shavua Tov. Goodbye for now.